So in case you haven't heard, Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Epstein are good buddies. Were good buddies before Jeffrey bit the dust. And emails have surfaced of Noam Chomsky. They didn't just know each other. Noam Chomsky said he fantasized about Jeffrey Epstein's island. On top of that, Noam Chomsky advised Jeffrey Epstein about how to avoid scandal and how to downplay the allegations about his sex trafficking ring in the media. Is pretty bad. I just want to talk about Noam Chomsky a little bit, because Noam Chomsky is a very, very good lesson for all of us. We need to just talk about who Noam Chomsky is. So Noam Chomsky is an American of Jewish descent. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He went to a socialist Hebrew school that was aligned with the Communist Party. As a teenager, he was a very high-achieving student. His mother was a member of the Communist Party. And when asked about that, he always says that's because she wanted to play baseball. Because it's true. Back in the day, the Communist Party, people joined it because it had a baseball league, right? The Communist Party was a real party. And people joined it not because they read about its political line on the internet, but because it was in the neighborhood. And if you lived in Brighton Beach, New York in particular, or other parts of Brooklyn, just like you might join a church in your neighborhood because your kid wants to sing in the choir, or you want a Sunday school or a daycare to take your kid to. Noam's mother joined the Communist Party, and she said because she wanted to play baseball. And it's true that if you were a woman, the only people running a high school girls baseball league in the neighborhood, in this poor neighborhood full of Jewish immigrants from different parts of Eastern Europe, was the Communist Party. Think about that. So Noam's mom joined the Communist Party because she wanted to play baseball. Noam grew up and went to a Communist Party Hebrew school. It was like a Jewish Hebrew school that was run by the Communist Party. Noam, after World War II, Noam went into academia. He was an award-winning linguist. He was just a good linguist. And just like a lot of leftists, he opposed the Vietnam War. He denounced communism and became an anarchist, right? And in the 70s and 80s, suddenly Noam Chomsky became the face of anti-imperialism. And he was the critic of U.S. foreign policy, and he went on PBS very regularly. They would have him on PBS. They would have him on NPR. But mainly, he wasn't in American media, right? Noam Chomsky, many of his bios list Noam Chomsky as being the most quoted source in the English language after the Bible. Now, that's not true anymore, but that was true in the 70s, 80s, even in the 90s. Why? Because Noam Chomsky was quoted in Soviet media. He was the famous American intellectual, the MIT Harvard professor, who would come out and give a very modest critique of U.S. foreign policy that got into mainstream media and then got picked up by Soviet media and communist and Soviet-aligned media and disseminated all over the world. And he got that gig. And that I've heard from people who lived in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. People in the Soviet Union thought everyone in America listened to Noam Chomsky. And really, the only people in America that ever heard of Noam Chomsky were leftists, socialists, communists, peace activist kind of people. They knew who Noam Chomsky was. But Noam Chomsky was on Soviet television almost every day. And that was arranged. And Noam Chomsky would always denounce the Soviet Union as a brutal dictatorship. But whatever the Soviet Union was saying about Nicaragua, or about Colombia, or about the Middle East, about Lebanon, about Palestine, Noam would echo it, right? And he would be an American voice that would echo Soviet criticisms of American foreign policy while denouncing the Soviet Union. And that's the role that he played. And what was weird about Noam Chomsky is, how did he get this gig, right? Right? You'd think, okay, well, maybe he's a famous professor of political science. Nope. Maybe he's a professor of world history. Nope. Maybe he's a professor of sociology. Nope. Maybe he's a professor of economics. No. Maybe Noam Chomsky teaches linguistics. So why in the hell? And here's the other thing. Okay, well, maybe Caleb, maybe Noam Chomsky, maybe that's not his field academically, but he was such an important activist, right? He was the leader of peace marches. Nope. Yeah, he was the leader of a socialist group. Nope. Noam was just a Harvard guy who grew up in communism, denounced communism, and became a weird anarcho intellectual, taught linguistics at MIT, and got the gig to be Mr. Smart Guy on American TV. I first encountered Noam Chomsky after 9/11, right? When I was first getting into leftist politics, I encountered Noam Chomsky. And there were two books by Noam Chomsky that came out right after 9/11. Right after 9/11, the whole country was in a super patriotic overdrive. We're going to go, I remember people had signs, nuke 'em, George, nuke 'em, and everyone wanted to bomb the whole Middle East and kill all the Muslims for 9/11, right? It was very right wing. It was a really scary, even in places like New York City, even in places that are very, very liberal, there was this kind of pro-war bloodlust, revenge, kill all the Muslims. It was frightening, right? You're lucky if you didn't experience that like I did. And I was in a little town. My little town practically turned into a military rally, for a couple of years, right? I mean, so many assemblies I had to sit through about we got to support the troops, and we had to make candy packets to give to the soldiers, every morning. And we had assemblies where they were denouncing the protesters, these un-American people who protest the war, and it was something. So in that atmosphere, as an 8th and 9th grader, I started reading Noam Chomsky. And at the time, and this is a lot of people's experience, and there are people defending Noam Chomsky now, and I mean, I can kind of, as much as I don't agree with them, I can understand why they might do that. For a lot of people, that was the only place, the only criticism of American foreign policy that you could ever hear. Right? And I remember after 9/11 at Barnes and Noble, there were two books by Noam Chomsky. One was just called 9/11, and the other was called Power and Terror. It was called Power and Terror. And it made very, very basic criticism of U.S. foreign policy, basically saying 9/11 was very, very horrible, but America's done a lot of awful things. I remember one of the big lines in the 9/11 book, or it was one of them, Power and Terror or the 9/11 book. One of the big lines is Noam Chomsky, and of course he has the most boring voice ever. He says, after 9/11, people said that New York City looked like Beirut. But we also must point out Beirut looks like Beirut. And part of the reason that Beirut looks like Beirut is because of American policy. Wow. Mind blown. Utterly profound. But actually, when I was in 9th grade, I couldn't find anyone else saying that. And from there, he lists various covert operations the CIA has carried out in Beirut, blowing up mosques and, and arming terrorist groups. And Beirut looks like Beirut because of America. Okay, that's the point of the book. That's like the only point of the book that I remember. But he basically just says 9/11 was awful. I really feel bad about it. But America's also done some bad things around the world. That's the point of the book. Right? That's really it. I also remember, I think it was in Power and Terror, that he talked about how Japanese people are offended that Americans called the site of the Twin Towers Ground Zero, because Ground Zero was the term invented for the places you couldn't go after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I didn't know that, right? But Ground Zero, after they nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were certain areas you couldn't go to because they were covered in nuclear dust, and they were called Ground Zero. You weren't supposed to go there. And after 9/11, for some reason, we just started calling the site of the Twin Towers Ground Zero. And that a lot of Japanese people took great offense at that. I didn't know that. Okay, fine. That's all I learned from the book. All I learned from the book. And it's said in the most dull, kind of boring way But that was Noam's gig. And that was Noam's gig. So Noam Chomsky. So then the other thing is Noam Chomsky was very opposed to the war in Iraq, right? Said that even if Iraq does have weapons of mass destruction, America has such weapons too. And I mean, it was like he was opposed to the war in Iraq. And after 9/11, there was kind of like he was the one opposition. He was like the controlled opposition. He was like the made for TV opposition, the voice of criticism of U.S. foreign policy. And I look back on those years now, and I've said this many times on these streams. In some way, well, that's a whole nother rant I can talk about another time, but the messaging wasn't very helpful after 9/11. The American public was traumatized by a horrendous act of terrorism. And Noam said, yeah, but we've done bad stuff too. And to most people, that sounded like, oh, you're saying we deserved it, which is not what he was saying, but that's kind of how it came across. And it was just like the narrative was kind of like America has gone around the world and done lots of bad things. True. Now someone did something bad to us. True. And so let's just kind of sing Kumbaya. And I don't know. It was not the most coherent anti-imperialism. I'll just put it that way. And Howard Zinn said similar things and all of that. But after Obama got elected, Noam Chomsky suddenly changed his tune. He didn't oppose U.S. foreign policy. During the Arab Spring, he supported the overthrow of Gaddafi. He cheered for the overthrow of Gaddafi. And he cheered for Libya, for the overthrow of Libya, or over the overthrow of Libya, for Syria, for the Syrian conflict. So much so, he even wrote an article that was in the New York Times saying that America was more afraid of the revolution against Assad than they were of Assad, and that America didn't really want Assad to fall because the revolution from below was just so glorious and had so much hope. It was utterly despicable. And I have had one encounter with Noam Chomsky. You can cancel me now. I have talked to somebody who talked to Jeffrey Epstein. I did have my encounter with Noam Chomsky, and I will show you that video. This is Caleb Maupin meets Noam Chomsky. It's funny. It was after Occupy Wall Street. It was in like 2012, I think, or 2013. All right. I was a reporter for Press TV stationed at the UN, and there were two events I could cover that day. Two. And one of the events was Russell Brand. I was invited to a reception with Russell Brand, the actor, and the other was to go to this event where I could ask Noam Chomsky a question as a reporter from Press TV. So I had to pick Russell Brand, Noam Chomsky. Russell Brand, Noam Chomsky. I picked Noam Chomsky. Looking back, I probably should have picked Russell Brand. I probably should have picked Russell Brand, but what the hell? I mean, it's kind of funny. That was my pick. Are you going to go to the Occupy Wall Street? I got an invitation from people I know. He was having a special reception for Occupy people. I was invited. I got a ticket to go meet Russell Brand and hang out with Russell Brand to talk about Occupy Wall Street. I had one ticket, and Noam Chomsky was coming to the UN that day. And I figured, well, I was getting paid by the story. I was a freelancer. And so I said, I better go talk to Noam. So Noam Chomsky came to the United Nations to speak, and he was invited by the Arab League. The Arab League, right? That's Saudi Arabia and, Qatar and Oman and Yemen and Kuwait. And the Arab League had just expelled the Syrian government, right? Syria was expelled from the Arab League, right? And the Arab League paid Noam Chomsky, I'm sure, millions of dollars with their oil money to come and give a speech condemning Israel at the United Nations. So Noam showed up. And I'm there as the Press TV reporter, TV network from Iran. And it had just been revealed that Israel had assassinated 4 nuclear energy scientists who were running Iranian nuclear power plants. And so I went to this event and I asked Noam Chomsky about the Iranian nuclear scientists who were killed. And this is my one interaction with Noam. This is Caleb talking to Noam Chomsky, right? So you can cancel me. I talked to a guy who is an Epstein collaborator. I didn't know that at the time, obviously. This is Caleb with Noam Chomsky.
Press TV News. And in the last couple days, there have been reports in the U.S. media quoting figures from the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a terrorist organization, alleging that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And it has been leaked that the Israeli government has cooperated with Mujahideen Khalq to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. And my question is that a violation of international law? And why is it that Israel is cooperating with what was at one point universally recognized as a violent terrorist organization?
Violation of international, we can debate this or that fact that's not yet accepted and agreed, but there are gross violations of international law which are proclaimed openly and publicly and presented with self-praise. So, for example, suppose that when President Obama, or any Western, any American diplomat or journalist, says that with regard to Iran, all options are open, as is said constantly, what does that mean? All options are open means force is open, means nuclear attack is open. Those of you who may recall an obscure document called the UN Charter might remember Article 2, which bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. The threat or use of force.
Now, he didn't answer my fucking question, right? Or he did answer it. He answered it with the 4 Ds of dodgeball: dodge, dip, duck, and dodge. I asked him about the Mujahideen Khalq terrorists murdering Iranian nuclear scientists. And he said, why focus on one crime? Every time Obama says all options are on the table, that's use of force. That violates the UN Charter. Like, it's universally accepted that Israel and MEK teamed up to kill these nuclear scientists. I asked him to condemn it, and he made a point of not giving me the soundbite I needed. Why? Well, at that point, the Arab League that had paid for him to be there, he was paid. I mean, you can bet he was paid, and it was not a secret that he was paid, right? I mean, it was the Arab League hosted this whole event for Noam, and they were anti-Iran, right? Iran and the Arab League were not getting along. It was that Sunni Shia thing, and he was there, and that would have offended his hosts if he had said something to the benefit of Iran, like Israel murdered one of their nuclear scientists. That wouldn't be helpful, now would it? So instead, he dodged my question. Yes, and Amy Goodman is sitting next to him, and there were a whole layer of people that were generally critics of U.S. foreign policy, that as soon as Obama took office, they were on board with U.S. foreign policy in Syria, in Libya, especially on Russia, hating Russia, Ukraine, all that stuff. And that's very, very suspicious to me. Now we find out about Noam and Epstein. And, I have maintained for a long time that, look, part of the way the Soviet Union was brought down is that in the 70s and 80s, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, officially as a democratic centralist party, they all said the same thing. The official government line was put forward in a very dull way. But beneath the surface, there were 2 factions, the hardliners and the reformists or the moderates. And the U.S. government courted the moderates. And the moderates were people like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who were convinced that the USA would let them transition to becoming a social democratic welfare state. And that's what they believed. That's what Gorbachev believed. That's what Yeltsin believed, is that communism, Marxism, Leninism was outdated, and that the West wasn't so bad, right? Imperialism wasn't so bad. It was just Reagan. It was just those Republicans, the bad ones. But Bill Clinton and Bernie Sanders and the liberals are not so bad, and they'll help the Soviet Union adopt more human rights and transition to becoming not a communist government, not a planned economy, but a welfare state that gives people free health care and takes care of them. And that's what socialism really means. And if you read Gorbachev's speech, where he talks about universal human values, replacing Marxism, Leninism, and class struggle with universal human values, that's what was going on. Noam Chomsky was part of that operation. And that's what was going on. Is Noam was the most famous academic, the top linguist in America, and he didn't agree with those hardline communist policies, but he shared their criticism of U.S. foreign policy. And, he agreed that what the USA is doing in Nicaragua and what the USA is doing in Lebanon, and it's wrong. And he was there to court the reformist wing of the Soviet bureaucracy, to boost the Yeltsins and the Gorbachevs, and isolate the hardliners, right? And it was soft power manipulation. Look, folks, the Soviet Union was not brought down by Ronald Reagan. Fox News repeats that over and over. It was Ronald Reagan who escalated the arms race. That's what brought down the Soviet Union. No, that's what caused the Soviet Union lots of economic problems, because they had to spend money they should have spent building up their economy on building more nukes. It wasn't really an arms race. It was an arms catch-up, as Michael Parenti talks about. That's not what brought down the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was brought down by ideological subversion. Western leftism, the Frankfurt School, the hippie counterculture, pessimism, Malthusian environmentalism, the Western left inserted itself into the Soviet Union, and a big section of the Soviet Communist Party was recruited to be like the people that were harassing me in Minneapolis, to be woke, blue-haired environmental liberals. And those people were deceived by America to believe that if they got rid of the Soviet Union, America would say, good job, and they would become the next Norway or Sweden. That's not what happened. What happened is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs, who now says a lot of good things, but back then was an advocate of neoliberal economics, and the International Monetary Fund, they went in there to Russia and they looted the place. 30% unemployment, 80,000 factories closed their doors, extreme poverty at like 30, 40%. The fall of the Soviet Union was an economic catastrophe. And the country was sold off to the highest bidder and looted. And Noam was part of softening them up to let it happen, right? They needed people like Noam Chomsky to court the Soviet bureaucracy and to function as it's like a good cop, bad cop routine, right? We have American media to justify all the stuff America's doing, but we also need to show that there's criticism. But they didn't put some activist who'd organized a mass movement on there. They didn't put someone like Michael Parenti, who was pro-Soviet. They put Noam there to say, yeah, the Soviet Union's bad. It violates human rights, but also America is bad, and Beirut looks like Beirut. And, it's just, that's Noam Chomsky. All right. That's Noam Chomsky. And the fact that he's involved with Jeffrey Epstein, the big thing that everyone talks about with that is that Noam Chomsky is notoriously anti-Israel. But yet, he told everyone not to boycott Israeli products. You remember that? That was a big thing. The Palestinians, Hamas, and the West Bank leadership. Hamas runs Gaza, right? And Fatah runs the West Bank. One thing they agreed on is they called on all their allies, everyone who supports the Palestinians, boycott Israeli businesses. And they actually had a list of like 12 businesses based in Israel to boycott. And Noam came out, no, don't boycott Israel. That's not going to work. Not going to work. Don't do that. It's not a good thing to do. Look, we need to talk to the Israelis, and we need Israel to stop violating. But if you boycott them, look, I understand most boycotts are stupid. All right. And I'll be honest with you. Boycotts, like 90% of the boycotts that leftists do, serve no purpose other than making the boycotter feel good about themselves. I don't shop at Walmart. I buy organic. I don't like that bullshit either. But the Montgomery bus boycott of Dr. Martin Luther King, that was a real boycott. They did not get on that bus, and they forced, civil rights legislation in a Supreme Court ruling, right? And union boycotts where they have pickets out in front, don't shop here, right? That's a real thing, right? BDS is a real thing. First of all, if the Palestinians had the entire Muslim world aligned with them, governments that have lots and lots of money are choosing not to purchase from these companies. And BDS was actually so much of a threat to Israel that it's illegal. Did you know this? It is illegal in multiple U.S. states to boycott Israel, right? In Alabama, if you're going to work for the state of Alabama as a teacher, as a sanitation worker, at like down to local dog catcher, anyone who's employed by the state of Alabama must sign, I pledge I will not boycott Israel. Can you believe this, right? North Carolina, if you're going to work for the state of America, you have to sign a document, I will boycott Israel. Now, in New York, it's a little bit different. In New York, public employees don't have to sign that they will boycott Israel. But if you are a company that gets a contract with the state of New York, and you are openly calling for a boycott of Israel, the state of New York must terminate all its contracts with you. It doesn't apply to individuals in the state of New York, thank God, but it applies to companies, right? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous, right? And that tells me the fact that they've put those laws on the books here in New York for companies in Alabama and North Carolina and all these states, the fact that they put those laws on the books tells me that boycott, divestment, and sanctions was a pretty big threat to Israel. And do you think the pro-Palestine movement is going to listen to, Netanyahu when he gets up and says, don't boycott Israel. We think you shouldn't boycott Israel. It's not the right thing to do. Gays for Palestine, barbecue them. No, you think no one's going to listen to him. Who can tell pro-Palestine people not to boycott Israel? If you want to make sure that people that are pro-Palestine keep buying Israeli products, who's one guy who can make it happen? I'm Noam Chomsky. The Palestinians are violating human rights. I denounce them, but Israel, Beirut looks like Beirut too. Noam Chomsky. This is what I'm telling you. Noam telling people not to boycott Israel is far more valuable, right? Netanyahu, Alan Dershowitz, if they get up there and say, don't boycott Israel, no pro-Palestine person's going to listen to them. No Muslim's going to listen to them. But if Noam gets up there and says it, it's very helpful. Well, now we find out that Noam, was a good friend with somebody that the Epstein files confirms was an Israeli spy and trained as an Israeli spy who had a sex harem and a sex island that Noam fantasized about. I mean, look at the emails for themselves. I mean, Noam Chomsky, look, if he was your gateway drug, if he was the first person you ever heard, if you watched Manufacturing Consent, this sucks. And I look, and sometimes you have to just go with what's there. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person. That doesn't mean your whole life has been a lie. It means that the only person you had access to say these things was him. After 9/11, the only person I could find who was not, repeating the war on terror talking points, who was it? Noam Chomsky. I read his books too. But then I moved on to, actual Marxists and anti-imperialists. I read William Z. Foster. I read, media from other countries, and I moved on from that. And Noam is there to make sure you don't, right? Noam is a gatekeeper. That's really what Noam Chomsky has always been. Noam Chomsky came out and said, after Oliver Stone made his film, JFK, Noam Chomsky put on press conferences all about don't investigate the killing of JFK. It doesn't matter who killed JFK because, JFK did the Bay of Pigs invasion. JFK sent advisors to Vietnam. He was just another warmonger. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. I mean, what's that about, right? A major Hollywood movie about a conspiracy to kill Kennedy comes out, made by a brilliant director, Oliver Stone. I've worked with his son before. You know, and I mean, Oliver Stone's amazing, really anti-imperialist, a friend of Russia, made a great Ukraine on Fire is an excellent film. And, you know, Oliver Stone makes this great movie about, you know, the holes in the story of the Kennedy assassination. So out of the blue, they roll out, Noam Chomsky comes out. It doesn't matter if they killed Kennedy. Kennedy did bad things too, and there are human rights violations from the Kennedy administration. So just don't worry about it. I'm the smart. They rolled him out, and after 9/11, one thing that Noam Chomsky did almost immediately after 9/11, they rolled out Noam. 9/11 conspiracies are racist. They're racist. Arab people can do bad things too. If you say that 9/11 was an inside job, you're saying that only white people can do acts of terrorism. That's racist. That's racist. You don't need a smart white guy to do an act of terror. And they rolled him out to say no to 9/11 truth. And you know, it was like it was like, you know, Noam's wheelchair. He was always there, you know, to roll him out of his office, and they would get all the media in front of him. And when they needed someone to tell anti-war people and leftists what to do, to tell us not to boycott Israel, to tell us not to think about 9/11 truth, to tell us not to think about who killed Kennedy, to tell us to support overthrowing Assad in Syria, to tell us to support overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya, whenever they needed somebody to tell us what to do and make us ineffective and tell us to not really be anti-imperialists, they rolled Noam out in his wheelchair and they pointed the CNN cameras at him and told us what to do. That's what Noam Chomsky is, and that's what he's always been. He is there to control us. He is like the corrupt union bosses, right? That's what the corrupt union bosses, the labor lieutenants of capital. For what labor union bosses, what Jimmy Hoffa and Richard Trumka and the AFL-CIA are for the labor movement, that's what Noam Chomsky has always been for the anti-war movement. He has never organized a protest. He has never built a mass anti-war movement. He's a Harvard, MIT guy that they found and picked to be our boss. And I am so fucking tired of this, right? And it frustrates me. We've got to stop letting our enemies pick our leaders for us, right? Right? And it continues to happen, right? You know, there are names I could name on here, and it's the same shit, right? It's the same shit, right? There's an organic movement of people really saying things, and so then they pick one of their people and make them say it. Stop letting our enemies pick our leaders for us, right? We didn't pick Noam Chomsky to lead anti-imperialism. They picked Noam Chomsky for us. They picked Mr. Boring Linguist Professor to tell us how to run our movement. And they put him on PBS and they put him on CNN. So he must be right, right? And even now that we find out he was going to Epstein's Island and all of that, even now that we find out what he was doing, you know, there's still people that are just, but I read his books. He's the one who got me thinking this way. Yeah, that's because he's the only one they would let you have. That's because you didn't do your own research. That's because you didn't investigate enough to find this YouTube channel. That's because you didn't investigate enough to know who Michael Parenti was. That's because you didn't investigate enough to watch RT. You know, you didn't investigate enough to watch Press TV. That's why. Okay? Yeah, I get it. He was the only one who was there when I was a kid, but I dug deeper, okay? It's not your fault. It's not an attack on you. If Noam was your gateway drug, that's not your fault. That's their fault. That's what they picked him to be. He's there to contain and control our anti-imperialist thought, and that's what he's always been, okay? That's what he's always been. And so, you know, we just need to understand that. And the fact that he is tied up with the Mossad, not a shocker. He's been tied up with the American CIA for a long time. Not a shocker. I told you when he was speaking at the UN, he was being paid by the Arab League and the vassal states of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, the Saudi head choppers, the Qatari monarchy that runs Al Jazeera. You know, again, are you shocked? No, I'm not shocked by any of this. I'm not shocked about any of this, right? Not shocked about any of this. And I really want to urge people to not get into fandom mode, right? Look, I hate to break it to you. Bad people can do good things, right? Noam did a lot of good things. I mean, he said a lot of true things about U.S. imperialism, right? That doesn't mean he was good, right? Hitler was an awful mass murdering dictator, but I can guarantee you that at least a few times in his life, he probably said something true. There were probably times where Hitler said, the sky is blue, and it was actually blue. And that doesn't mean the sky wasn't blue just because Hitler said it wasn't true, right? Bad people can do good things. Good people can do bad things and make mistakes, right? And that there's way too much of this in our circles in general of, I like this guy, so he can do no wrong. Or this guy I generally agree with on 90% of issues, let me down in his personal life, let me down by taking a position I don't agree with on this or that. So fuck him. Okay, we need to get over this, right? Take everything with a grain of salt. Noam Chomsky, his works are probably still worth reading. I probably have a couple of them on the shelf here still. I'm not throwing those books away. Right? I think I somewhere on this shelf. Yeah, I actually have a packet of Noam Chomsky books, right? I do. And you know what? I'm not throwing them away because there's true things in them. And I might quote them, right? I have this packet of the Noam Chomsky trilogy, right? The Prosperous Few and the Restless Many, What Uncle Sam Really Wants, Chomsky's Secret Lies and Democracy. I'm not throwing this away. I'm keeping this. Right? I've got books by U.S. presidents here. I've got books by Muslim scholars. I've got books by evangelical Christians. Look, this is useful stuff. You could probably find Noam useful. Was Noam a good dude? No. He was a gatekeeper of anti-imperialism. He's an Israeli agent, and he's collaborating with a sex trafficker. Not a good dude. But did he say true things in his life? Absolutely. And that was kind of his job, right? So we need to be more mature and nuanced in how we understand things, right? Meanwhile, there are good people who've let me down in various ways. Look, for example, Michael Parenti just died. I love Michael Parenti. I love his stuff, but he didn't get the growth-degrowth question, right? And you watch him. He didn't have the innovationist understanding. He didn't have the understanding of capitalist economics that Lyndon LaRouche and Lynn Marcus developed. He didn't get it. And many videos of Michael Parenti, he goes on and on about capitalism just wants more and more. It wants endless growth. And I'm sitting there watching this going, no, it doesn't. They want to beat down the productive forces. They have whole think tanks promoting Malthusianism. No, they don't. They want to stay at the top. That's what they want. They want all the profits to go to them, but they don't want endless growth. But that's nuance, and that's, Michael Parenti's awesome, but on a very important point, are you for growth or degrowth? Michael Parenti, you're not going to get an understanding of why imperialism is all about degrowth and why growth is the nature of anti-imperialism. You're not going to get that from Parenti. You're not, right? Well, that's okay. He does so much good work on so many other good questions. I'm not going to throw Parenti in the toilet. Parenti was a good guy, but on one very important question that is really the pinnacle of our, the linchpin of our innovationist turn that has broken us away from being communists and all of that. The pro-growth, poverty is not socialism, to be rich is glorious, right? Abundance for all. You're not going to get that from Parenti. You're going to get capitalism is bad because it needs endless growth. That's what you're going to get from Parenti. Well, he's wrong. But Parenti is still amazing. And am I throwing out my Parenti books? No. Right? Parenti was a good guy who was wrong on one question. Chomsky, it looks like, was a bad guy, but his bad guy job was controlling anti-war leftism and controlling anti-imperialism. And so in order to do that job effectively, he had to write books full of true things. Can we understand this? Do we get it, folks? Do we get it? Right? We have to understand that the world is a complicated place. There are very few people in this world that are all good and all bad, or all bad. And in fact, often the differences between people, and this is something that is a tough pill for some people to swallow, A lot of times the differences between people, it's not a question of good versus bad. It's a question of big versus small. Big people do really big good, but when they do bad, it's really bad. And big people, when they do really, really bad things, in order to get away with those bad things, they have to do, they have to do good stuff to get people to trust them, right? I mean, Hitler, the mass murdering dictator of Germany, would never have been able to do all the evil things he did if he didn't fix the German economy, right? If he didn't build the autobahns, and if he didn't provide universal employment and make Germany's economy really jump in the first years of his leadership. He did it through degrowth methods, but if he hadn't stabilized the German economy, he never would have been trusted enough to do World War II and the Holocaust and all the evil shit that he did, right? He had to do some good things and provide universal employment and stabilize the economy in order to do the evil that he did, right? And Stalin, right? Stalin, raised Russia up from nothing. Stalin built, the USSR into a modern country, but, there were a lot of people that got the death penalty. There were a lot of gulags. There were a lot of awful things. And those awful things we shouldn't pretend they weren't awful, right? Stalin did shit I would not do in my worst nightmare, right? And we shouldn't pretend that Stalin was Mr. Nice Guy and, sugar and spice and everything nice. And that's a point that I make in this upcoming book, that, Stalin was a meanie. Stalin was a nasty guy. And a lot of people, he was in situations, but he was doing what he thought was necessary to make Russia into a superpower, to defeat the Nazi invasion that killed 27 million of their people. We shouldn't pretend that Stalin was not somebody who did things that we hope in a million years we never even have to hear about someone that we know experiencing, right? Stalin, in order to do what he did, had to be very, very ruthless, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise, right? Stalin did amazing things. He lifted a country that was an agrarian, impoverished country into a superpower. He defeated the Nazis. He invented space travel. He electrified, and he took what was an impoverished country and he made it a strong, powerful, modern country. And he lifted more people up from poverty than you can imagine. The global movement against colonialism expanded in mass because of Stalin. But along the way, in order to deal with some of the most ruthless enemies a country or a nation can have, Stalin had to do lots of ruthless, awful things. And everybody admits that in 1936 and 37, a lot of innocent people ended up in gulags who shouldn't have been there. A lot of innocent people got executed in the panic, the Great Terror, Yezhovshchina. So let's not pretend. Let's not pretend that these were not hard times, and that the world is nuanced. The world is nuanced. The world is nuanced, and it's complicated. Okay? And that we can look at Noam Chomsky and say, okay, this was a guy who was assigned by American intelligence to gatekeep anti-imperialist thought. And in the process, he taught a lot of people about anti-imperialism. Okay. He did. But he did it to make sure somebody else didn't, who would have done a better job. And he did it while whispering, don't boycott Israel. Don't look into 9/11. Don't look into the JFK assassination. He did it while then flip-flopping as soon as Obama took office.